Okay, and now it's time for our keynote speaker, who is Matthew Rampley. And I believe this will be very interesting to all of us, but especially since we are here in SATEC, where mainly life sciences and natural sciences are done. He's extraordinary professor of art history at Masaryk University. So this is a special occasion, bringing art historian to SATEC, I believe. So he was previously professor of art history at the University of Birmingham, and his research interests are contemporary art, art criticism and theory, and art and architecture of Central Europe of the 19th and 20th century. So we are very happy to have you here. And the floor is yours. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would first of all like to thank you for the invitation to come and speak. It's a great pleasure and privilege, and I feel very honored to be able to share, I guess, my words of wisdom and my experiences as a researcher from outside the Czech Republic, within the Czech Republic. And as Anna said, I feel when I come to SATEC, which isn't that often, but I feel as if I'm coming to another world. And it's the same university, but it's an entirely different culture, in fact. So the culture of arts, or the philosophical faculty where I work is I would say it's a much less internationally focused faculty than maybe SATEC and, for example, English is, although English is theoretically, it's one of the working languages, but a lot of the business is done still in Czech. So it's a very different kind of culture. And I suppose that's one of the things I want to do today, is to talk about my experience in terms of, I'm not going to give you kind of tips on how to be a great researcher or anything like that. It's much more a kind of account of my experience of moving to the Czech Republic against my understanding of the way that any kind of research takes place within cultures, within an institutional culture, but also within a national culture. And many of my comments really are going to be about the challenges and exciting challenges, but also obstacles I've faced negotiating cultural differences, moving from Britain to the Czech Republic. Now, that's by way of an introduction. So I'm going to start just by saying a little bit about myself and to say what the story is and how I've ended up in Masaryk University, and then say a little bit more about the actual experiences and some of my observations, which some of you may find parallels, familiar stories that you've experienced. So, as Anna said, I'm an art historian, and currently I'm leading a project funded by the European Research Council called Continuity and Rupture in Art and Architecture in Central Europe. And it's a study of the legacy of the Habsburg Empire in the art, architecture and design of, well, three countries, Austria, what was Czechoslovakia, and Hungary between 1918 and 1939. And it's a project that we started in 2018. In theory, it should have finished, well, about now, but because of COVID, we managed to negotiate an extension to the project of 6 months. So it'll be coming to an end in March next year. So I'm at the latter phases, or my team and I are at the latter phases of the project. And of course, if any of you are interested in the project, that's our website there, which has lots of fascinating articles and material to keep you entertained and informed. Now, the project itself then was based around 4 themes, looking at the way in which, after 1918, the memory of the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary, persisted in the visual arts in Central Europe. And it's a theme that has often been explored in terms of literature, especially in relation to famous Austrian authors in particular, this kind of nostalgia about the lost Habsburg Empire. But we were interested in the project in looking at partly at kind of nostalgia, the way it's expressed in the visual arts, and also looking at the kinds of questions that raises about maybe certain well-established myths of national identity and history that have really become established since 1918. So it was not only looking at how artists, designers, architects were kind of looking back at the past in that period, but also looking at the way in which that was an important time when certain ideas of national cultural identity were formed, and partly kind of critiquing them, picking them apart a little bit as well. And as part of the project, these are the sort of key team members, although actually the most important person of the project is not here. I do apologize to Jana, who's our project manager, and she's far more important than any of the academics, but unfortunately there wasn't enough space on the slide. And at the top, Christian Drober, I gather he's going to be taking part in a panel discussion. He's very kindly agreed at the last minute to replace somebody who was unable to make it. So we're an international team, as you can see, a German, a Czech, an Austrian, and a Hungarian. So in that sense, we typify maybe the kinds of case studies or examples of international collaborative research that obviously CzechSpats is interested in. And as Anna said, I started off by, we started the project at the University of Birmingham in 2018, which is where originally I was first established. So that's the kind of project, and that's what I'm doing here together with the team members. So the first question, I suppose, that may be asked is, how is it that we ended up moving from Birmingham to Brno, and what was the motivating factor behind that? Well, there were a few reasons why we decided to move. And one of them, I probably hardly need to say who these figures are, in case you're not too familiar with British politics. On the left here, you have Theresa May, and then, is this the pointer? Or how does the pointer work? There we are. I'm not sure if it does it? Anyway, on the top right there, you have Nigel Farage and his best friend, Donald Trump, and then below, Boris Johnson doing his best to traumatize a Japanese schoolchild. Now, of course, the common factor to all of these is Brexit. And because obviously Farage, I don't know how well known he is internationally, but although he was never a major political leader of any political party that achieved electoral success, yet he was the main figure campaigning behind the idea of Brexit, and in a way he managed to completely transform the landscape of British politics. And really, one of the reasons, and important reasons, why we moved from Britain to the Czech Republic was because in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, which was in 2016, Britain became an extraordinarily toxic environment in which to work. Both within the university, for example, there were absolutely poisonous professional relations were often poisoned based on if you voted for or against. I think most academics, very few academics voted to leave the EU, but some did. And more generally in the society as well, Britain became, and it still is arguably, quite a kind of dysfunctional place as a result of the, I guess, the Pandora's box that the Brexit referendum opened up. So Britain became a much less agreeable place to work in many respects, and where I had imagined that it was certainly in comparison with many places in Europe, very cosmopolitan, open, tolerant, very international. It turns out that actually that was true of only a minority of the population. So it was quite a kind of traumatic event, the experience of the referendum and its aftermath. So that was one reason. A second reason was because of the nature, the kind of Brexit that was being negotiated, because after the referendum, in certain respects, the referendum didn't settle anything, because there was always the question of what kind of Brexit would the British government opt for? And eventually, of course, the British government opted for the worst kind, almost cutting off any significant ties with the EU, and that included membership of the European Research Council. And for a long time, you may or may not be aware that at the moment, the European Research Council, Britain is not a member of the European Research Council, and it's raised. I mean, I'm a panelist. I'm a member of one of the panels on the European Research Council, and it's been quite interesting the issues we've had to deal with, what the protocols are for dealing with applications from Britain, because there still are some as well. And the obvious concern that I had was what the fate of the ERC of our project would be, given that there was all this uncertainty about whether the British government was going to commit to the ERC or not. And there were these kind of vague promises made about, well, maybe if you've got an ERC project, maybe we'll find the money somewhere else for you. But all of this seemed very unreassuring. So we had a discussion with the team, and it wasn't an easy discussion, I have to say, but we decided that maybe staying in Britain was problematic, because it could mean that people's jobs would be put in jeopardy. And that was something, I mean, my own personal job was not a problem, but obviously for the members of the team, it seemed that staying in the EU was really a priority to ensure the continuity and the future of the project. So we considered a number of different possibilities. Obviously, Central Europe. One institution or one country, I think, almost immediately we discounted, and that was Hungary. On the top right there, that's the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. There are some very fine researchers there, but given the toxic environments and the way that the Orbán government is kind of interfering in academic life in very worrying ways, we decided that was never going to be an option. And particularly because the Hungarian member of our team, she actually came to Britain in order to escape from Hungary. So it would have seemed particularly cruel to then move back again. And so the choice was really between the Czech Republic and in the bottom right there, Austria, Vienna. And for all sorts of different reasons, we ended up opting for Maastricht University. I had numerous very promising, very positive conversations with the then head of departments in the art history department here at Maastricht University. And I should say also maybe what a significant additional factor that persuaded us to move here was not only that the university promised to accommodate us and was happy to do so, but also there was this Maastricht Award in Science and Humanities that the university was offering, which paid for, well, both the rest of my salary and an additional researcher on the team and all sorts of other activities as well. So it seemed an offer that was too good to be true in many respects. And I think the university really does need to be credited for the great efforts and support that we had in moving here, and it's been very nice to kind of maintain that kind of contact with many colleagues who from those early days who were very supportive of our move to the Czech Republic. So initial experiences, and what were they like? Well, initially, We were the object of considerable curiosity, and we were on television, all sorts of newspapers. Do people still talk about newspapers? I don't know. It doesn't seem right, does it, to talk about online publications? But I'm of the generation, I still think of them as newspapers. Anyway, but the media, the press, were really very curious and very interested in this, very enthusiastic, because it was unusual to see, I guess, well, I'll just say a senior academic in Britain, senior mostly because of my age, I must say. But anyway, a senior academic moving to the Czech Republic from Britain, because so often the direction of travel is the other way. And so that did arouse a lot of curiosity. And I had some very interesting conversations with, when people say, well, why were you doing this? And well, one reason coming here was also because of my family connection. My wife is from Brno, and so I already knew it very well. And I knew, I was always already, I thought I was well immersed in Czech culture, but I'll say more about that soon. And also the other thing, that if it was a choice between Brno or Vienna, for example, it was Brno because the coffee is better in Brno. There are better cafes. I really just don't understand all this nonsense about Austrian Viennese coffee. It's just really poor quality. Anyway. And I also know indirectly that apparently the Indian restaurants are better in Brno than in Vienna as well. So these things are important, and Vienna is, I mean, it's nice, but it's overrated. So anyway, so there were lots and lots of articles about this strange British professor moving here, including this one in Arts and Antiques. It's quite a prominent journal on sort of current events in arts that I couldn't find online. That I even managed to include a photograph of my dog in this particular article. So it's the whole family experience was involved. So there was I had a very positive initial experience, and it felt good, and there was a very good vibe about coming here, and that really is important, and I am enormously grateful. But now that I shouldn't say "but" in that emphatic way, but I think at the same time I was also naive about the what are the challenges when anybody moves to another culture and they think that it's going to be the same. And I suppose particularly we often imagine when we talk about academic life, we all have contacts internationally with colleagues, and we just imagine it's going to be the same wherever we go, whereas in fact it isn't at all. And I think that it is really important to be mindful of that. And I would say I was underprepared in many respects for, and this is after 4 years of experience, for that sort of experience. I understand quite what it was, because before I came, I suppose I had a view of Czech culture. I do apologize for the spelling error at the top there. People I thought embodied Czech culture. Those of you who may not be familiar, Milada Horáková, who was a really important figure. She was basically a martyr to a communist show trial, I think in 1950, but somebody might correct me about that. But she's often seen as kind of embodying a certain kind of, a kind of political figure of conscience. And then, of course, Václav Havel, internationally known. Those of you who are not familiar with the art world may not recognize Toyen in the center there. An interesting and important surrealist painter working in the 20s and 30s, mostly, although she lived much longer than that. And these figures, and I would say probably internationally, they encapsulate perhaps a certain view of Czech culture, which sees it as maybe humanistic, progressive, tolerant, and it is all of those things, of course it is. But like any culture, it has other aspects to it as well. And I think that I assumed that this was the whole story of Czech culture, and it would be full of people like Václav Havel, for example. And of course, like anywhere, just as Britain has its share of Boris Johnson, so in the Czech culture, Czech society has its own equivalents. I deliberately thought that maybe at the bottom, you probably would recognize whose hairstyle that is. Now, I'm making a joke here, but this is a serious point, which is that obviously, for me, I underestimated, I think, the kind of diversity of Czech culture, and the fact that alongside these kind of figures of representing the kind of this idealized image of Czech culture, there are also other strands of Czech society who have a very different kind of view, just as the Brexit referendum for me was quite a shock in terms of what I thought Britain was about. So likewise, coming here, I found that obviously Czech society too has other aspects to it, which I guess I probably had difficulty negotiating, because there is I'm not saying that within the university there are lots of people like Miloš Zeman, for example, or Andrej Babiš, of course not. But nevertheless, there is a kind of, I would guess probably I would say Czech culture, and this has filtered down, I would say, into academic life in a way, is probably more conservative than I had imagined. So that in the Anglo-American world, whether it's the States or Canada, Australia, or Britain, academic institutions tend to be very liberal, quite left-wing in their politics. Most academics that I ever knew were quite liberal, quite left-wing, even if they weren't sort of radical Marxists, whereas I found that that isn't the case here. And it meant that sometimes I would find myself out of step a little bit with colleagues, to the extent that sometimes very, very strange accusations would be leveled at me for things I thought were fairly uncontroversial, or would have been uncontroversial, maybe in a British context. And I can appreciate that maybe within SATEC, if you can focus on microbiological research, maybe that's not such an issue. But in the humanities, where you're always talking about human culture, where human culture is the focus of your research, then quite clearly this can become an issue. I'll just give you one example, which was I guess I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jordan Peterson. Does anybody know his name? Well, there was this case a few years ago when he was invited to give a talk in Cambridge, and then he was disinvited, and then the rector of the university in Olomouc stepped in and offered him, say, well, you can come here and speak instead. I never know if he took up the offer, but anyway. And I became involved in this discussion online with various people about precisely this invitation. And I just said something which I thought was a fairly uncontroversial thing. I said, well, I would never censor somebody like Jordan Peterson, but at the same time, I just wouldn't bother to invite him because I just don't think he has anything that's very interesting to say. And that's not the same as blocking him or censoring him. And the responses I got were very interesting. People accusing me of being like they're saying, well, you're just like some communist, politically correct officer. You remind me of when I was at school. And that was a kind of, a bit of a jolt, actually, for me. I just hadn't expected that kind of response. And I think that the reason I say that is, well, you'll perhaps understand later. So there's a different kind of cultural political environment, which I think I probably had been naive about, and I'm still learning how to negotiate around that. Other things which I think were, I think are worth commenting on, and which certainly I've had experience of, which is that obviously Czech is notoriously difficult as a language. I actually don't think this this map is quite right, because I for a little while, I started learning Hungarian, and much to the disturbance of some colleagues, I think Hungarian is actually easier than Czech, but that doesn't mean that it's easy either. So now the reason I say this is simply because we know that one of the, I guess one of the obstacles, one of the difficulties that Czech institutions have, Czech universities have, is that Czech is not an international language. And it suffers from that. And I do have great sympathies for colleagues who have to deal with the fact that they, in order to make their way in the world, they have to learn English or maybe German. But the point is, the Czech academic world is not big enough to be self-sustaining in many disciplines. But at the same time, it's a kind of a barrier. Although in the natural sciences, I think natural sciences, the research is thoroughly immersed within international networks. That isn't quite the same within the humanities. And as a result, as I said earlier, within the arts faculty, it's not as international an environment. And I think it's to do with questions of language. For example, not so many researchers would come to the Czech Republic certainly to work there, because they would find the language issue off-putting. They would imagine going to Germany or France, no problem, or Spain, you know, even though I would argue that French is irrelevant these days. But nevertheless, I'm just saying that as a provocation, of course. It's relevant for French people. But seriously, it is an issue. And of course, I spend a lot of time talking with colleagues in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's the same issue. There was a time when I spent quite a lot of time in Estonia, and where the issue is even worse there. You know, you probably have about 1 million people, million speakers of Estonian. And so it's an issue because it's off-putting, because, you know, at school in Britain, you know, the choice of foreign languages was Latin, French, and German, you know, but Czech or even Polish, it just wasn't there, you know. And so I accept that that is a problem. But I think that I had misrecognized the impact that that has on the academic culture and maybe the way people think as well, because there is a kind of what you could call, well, it would be unfair to say a kind of a small nation syndrome, but there is a certain kind of sense of, and it's deeply embedded actually within Czech history as well, I think, a sense of being a small nation that everybody ignores, that nobody really takes seriously. And it's deeply embedded in certain kind of, you know, cultural stereotypes. Think of, you know, one of the most famous Czech characters, Švejk, you know, who his whole reputation is being based on the notion of the small guy facing up against you know, all these wicked Austrian authorities, you know, from the big castle or whatever, or even, I mean, Masaryk as the, you know, first president, he writes about the problem of the little nation. And Ladislav Holý, who was a sociologist, historian, who was Czech, but actually based in Scotland, and I wrote this book about the small Czech person and the great Czech nation. And there's been a lot of study about this kind of cultural pathology and its impact on professional attitudes, the way people think about themselves. And the reason that perhaps I had underestimated that was because it meant that for me, being British, coming to the Czech Republic, I automatically, didn't matter what I said, but I counted as somebody coming from one of the big countries that are used to bullying the others around. And as a result, you know, there'll be a sense of, who do you think you are? You know, this British person telling us what to do. Incidentally, when I worked in Scotland for a while, I encountered a similar kind of problem there. You know, the Scots really didn't like the English because it's that same sense of a kind of reluctance or almost a kind of, yeah, just not wanting to have somebody from a bigger neighbor telling them what to do, okay, because it's a kind of it's built in on all sorts of, I would call it a kind of cultural pathology. And I would fully admit that I probably underestimated the importance of that when I came here, and I still do. And I still know that I say things, and I can see that you can talk about as much as you like about, you know, international cooperation and so forth, but when there's that legacy of a kind of inbuilt self-perception, it's very difficult to overcome, and it does certainly has shaped, I think, or it affects, you know, the issue of settling into a Czech university. You have to be sensitive to that, and I don't think I was, or I'm still learning how to do that. And so I sort of put together maybe a list of other things then, which I think could be, I think do need to be addressed, and certainly I've kind of learned, in which I didn't know before. And so, as I said, cultural sensitivity, that's the first one, and that's something which I fully can be open to criticisms that I haven't been culturally sensitive enough. And, you know, this phrase, being a bull in a china shop, just walking in, saying, well, what I think is this, you know, and everybody think, oh God, here we go again, you know, Matthew with his big mouth, just kind of, you know, because that's the culture I'm from as well. That's the other thing. The converse of that is I do think that maybe people can be overly defensive, and I think you have to be very careful of that. You know, criticisms can be taken very personally, rather than being accepted as criticisms of the way an institution works. People then think you're criticizing them, you're attacking them personally. And there's this kind of sense of local pride, you know, who do you think you are, you know? And if I say to people, I'm not criticizing you personally, this isn't about you, it's about the way the institution works, or it's about the way the department works or doesn't, or whatever. And sometimes I think people still, I think that's still, you know, related to part of this cultural pathology. Similarly with horizons as well. I've noticed that on the one hand, the university has very impressive global horizons, and it was very nice to hear about that just before I started here. You know, that was one of the things that really appealed to me about Masaryk University compared with some other universities in Prague, for example, that don't seem to have that same kind of ambition. And yes, at the same time, my experience has been there's sometimes a bit of a mismatch between those ambitions and what happens on the ground, where people still tend to think locally. And not only that, but I have underappreciated, I think, probably the extent to which, when I sort of say, well, look, rather than sending this article to this or that, you know, local journal, why don't you try to send it to this one that's published in Chicago, for example? That's what will get you, you know, people will read that. They'll notice you. Nobody will read it if it's published in this local journal. And I can see the kind of look of panic on people's face when you suggest that. And there is, this kind of over modesty, I would say, which is built around maybe a sense of being the little guy or woman. I do apologize for the sexist nature of that metaphor, but that kind of sense of being from a small nation, and that, well, we can't possibly do that, and it is really something that I've noticed, and it is important to be sensitive to. So just simply saying, send it there is hopeless, actually, to say to people, because there's so much that needs to be unpacked. That's certainly been my experience anyway. The other thing is academic hierarchy and patronage and the culture of decision making, which for me, I guess, has been the biggest issue in one sense in negotiating the difference between Britain and the Czech Republic. Because if you're a professor in Britain, so what? You still have to, you're still managed by somebody. And in my previous job in Birmingham, I was managing professors, telling them what to do, giving them duties, working out their workloads for them, because that's the nature of academic management in Britain. You know, as a professor, the first thing you're told is, These are your responsibilities to the department, to the faculty, to other people. Whereas, of course, here it's a very different culture, and being a professor, professors are kings or queens. Unfortunately, it's kings because it's still a very masculine. The gender balance is still quite, imbalance is still quite high, and that means again my ability to negotiate that under sensitivities around. What can and can't be said to professors, or how does it work? How are any decisions made? I still find quite difficult, and has been quite difficult for me, I guess. And that is something that needs to be, one needs to be sensitive to, I think. Equally, I would say that maybe if Czech universities really want to become more international, they could scrutinize their own embedded cultures, which I think are not in keeping with international norms. But I won't say more than that, because I'll be very unpopular. But I'm willing to say more once the camera is turned off, if we have time for any discussions. There are other legacies as well. And one of them, of course, is the legacy of communism. And I'm really always interested to see how that has left a mark. But it's kind of burned in the memory in the way that people respond to things that you say as well. In particular, I've learned that there are certain words that you can't use in the Czech environment, even though actually I think that Czech universities desperately need them. So if you say, we need a strategy for this, instantly people will say, oh, that's just like communism, you're a Bolshevik, including just recently, we had a very fierce argument within the department about, just simply saying, we need a strategy to improve our gender equality. That's Bolshevism. That was the response, not from everybody, obviously, but from some colleagues. Or plan, targets, committee, meeting, all of these words, which I think, in a way, are one of the reasons why maybe, despite the fact there's excellent research taking place in Czech universities, but why I personally think they underperform internationally. If you look at rankings internationally, it's not a great story, and it's not because there aren't lots of excellent people in Czech universities, but there isn't enough strategic thinking, and there needs to be more. But there's still this legacy of communism, and all these words have these connotations which are toxic. And I can see a few people nodding their heads because they've had experience of this. And and I think that finally, these are just the final three things that I just want to say is other things which, my observation as an international, scholar coming to the Czech Republic they're kind of used as watchwords but I found the most baffling. I'll start with academic freedom. Which I think actually is great, but I think it's misinterpreted and it's used by many people as a way of avoiding accountability. I'll just put it like that. And academic freedom, that's really should be about making sure that you don't have central government impinging in what universities teach and research. But it's not about simply saying, I can ignore what my university wants because I want academic freedom. But that's how it's often understood. Who is in charge? Well, my personal politics are quite left-wing, but I don't believe in democracy when it comes to running universities. And I think the fact that you have elections for deans, rectors, heads of department means that it weakens structures of authority and management, and that's something that I think has a negative impact. Actually, the university has great strategic ideas, but there doesn't seem to be a structure for ensuring that they're implemented. And that's linked to, I think, a kind of culture of management, which is based on the fact that everybody's selected. And rigidity, that's the final thing. Rigidity over rules and procedures. And this is surprisingly, I suppose, a hangover from communism, which has been kept. Maybe it goes back further to the Habsburg Empire as well. But I find that the university here, there are certain set procedures, and even though they make no sense, but people hold on to them really fiercely, even though they have no sense. A particular bugbear at the moment, actually, with me personally, is actually the title of professor. I mean, when I came, I was already a professor. I'd been a professor for 12 years, and I understood that I just couldn't automatically become a professor in a Czech university, but I had to make an application. It's this kind of rigidity in terms of rules and regulations, which I guess in terms of my settling in, I found quite difficult to adapt to or to accept. So it just, that's really what I want to say. Just to conclude then, is that I've been enormously grateful for the positive welcome I received at the university. But at the same time, I think it is important to acknowledge, that there have been, it's not all been a straightforward story. And some of that has been, or a lot of that has been my own naivety, I would say, about understanding Czech culture, understanding the way Czech universities work. Some of them, though, may also be to do with certain kinds of issues to do with the culture of universities, which in a way, it's great that Maastricht University has these international ambitions. It's a pity that it seems much more difficult to adapt and change and to take seriously the observations of international scholars who work for it. Thank you. Are there any questions, or is there time for questions? Is that what you expect?
I think we are a little bit late, but I hope there is still time for questions, and I believe there will be some questions. So, any questions from the audience? Okay.
Okay, so I have a question here from the Zoom chat, actually. Blanca asks, would you have considered moving to the Czech Republic or somewhere else had Brexit not happened?
Probably not. No, because I mean, I would actually say that I was just actually bored, actually, at Birmingham University. So, but I think nevertheless, if Brexit happened, probably I wouldn't, because it is a big step, to move abroad, I mean, especially when you've got family, when you've got kids, when you've got children, it is a big. But on the other hand, I mean, it was also that sense of, well, it's quite an adventure. I've had enough of Birmingham University. And, what would be the alternatives? Move to somewhere else and it would just be the same. So, probably not. But then I would have missed out on all the great things that I have experienced, so.
Great talk, Matthew, and I think I can empathize with many things you said.
Yeah.
But one question I have for you is, so is there any quick fix? If someone said, okay, let's fix X tomorrow, what would be number one?
I'm not sure there's one single thing that I would say there was a quick fix. Maybe, well, one thing could be, I guess, just off the top of my head, actually, salary structures, because that's really opaque and I think it's dysfunctional in all sorts of ways. I guess maybe, I shouldn't say too much, otherwise I'll probably cause too much of a stir. I think issues of what I would call governance, actually, of the university, and I do think it's a Czech thing. It's not Maastricht University particularly, and I do think in certain ways it's dysfunctional and it's counterproductive, So the university, the rector has, spelled out what are really great aims that I entirely agree with, but because the governance is so dysfunctional, that it doesn't happen. That's it. But in terms of quick fixes, well, what I would say is that maybe those Czechs who have had experience of working abroad, and they've had experience of what international norms are like. You see, this is the thing. I've often had arguments with colleagues who just refuse me to believe when I say, it's not like that elsewhere. Actually, the Czech Republic You know, because sometimes they do, you know, oh, it's us, you know, and you say, but internationally, it's not just about Britain, you know, it's not me, as you know, it's like that everywhere, you know, and I guess those people who have greater degrees of international experience should really perhaps speak up much more in trying to move the culture on, and to try and counter those voices who are against change. And of course, it's the same in any institution. People don't like change, you know, and we're at a moment where I guess my perception is that the Czech university managements have acknowledged and they've recognized the need for change, but the message hasn't got down all the way. And part of the blockage is to do with, you know, things like, yeah, as I said, professors who just seem to be unaccountable to anything, you know, and that kind of issue, so I think it would be important to kind of keep pushing and say it's not good enough to simply say, well, it was like that in 1995, so why should we change? Which sometimes happens, you know.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I noticed that you didn't comment on sort of the experience download with the new students. Did you have any chance to interact with Czech students as part of your research? And what was that? How would you comment on that experience?
Yeah, it's been great actually. I've done some, I mean, I'm kind of 100% research, but I have done some teaching, and I'm supervising some PhD students as well. As always, it's a mixed bag. One of the things that's really refreshing compared with Britain, where because, you know, when they introduced these high fees, has completely destroyed the culture there, because now students are customers, and that's, you know, that's always what they bring into the conversation. I'm paying for this, you know, and it's terrible. It's really terrible in all sorts of ways, and that's different here. So I haven't really enjoyed that, again, I would say I think maybe there are problems with PhD students, not with the individuals, but the way things are structured around PhD students. But yeah, no, I have enjoyed that, and you know, the students that I've taught have been it's just mostly been master's students, but most of them have been quite serious, you know. So yeah, that's been good.
Okay, so no more questions from the audience. I would maybe have just a small one. Do you speak Czech already?
I do, and I passed my Czech language exam recently for citizenship. Oh. So don't worry, it doesn't mean that much. Yeah, so that was, but it's not a particularly high level. So yeah, but I mean, I read Czech all the time, you know, just for work. But speaking is, you know, yeah.
Okay, so you plan on staying here?
Well, that's the plan. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I mean, becoming a Czech citizen, you know, although if, you know, I've got to do things like find documents that prove I'm not a mass murderer, and there are all these documents that you need to, you know, demonstrate, you know. Which will be difficult for Britain, because in Britain I was a mass murderer, you know, and so that's why.
Obviously, yeah.
I did put that on the. Yeah.
Okay. There was one.
I wanted to ask you, like, for how long are you planning to stay here in the Czech Republic?
Yeah, well, well, let's put it this way: when we moved here, it wasn't on the assumption. I mean, some people just assume, oh, you'll just go back in 5 years. And that wasn't the assumption. And that was also why it was quite a big decision to decide to come here. And then think, well, especially because I'm at an age, I mean, I'm not that young anymore. And so that means that I'm no longer at the age where you can just keep on, you know, moving everywhere. So it was going to be a kind of a long-term commitment, yeah.
Okay, and thank you for a great talk, and I hope there will be more and more scholars coming to the Czech Republic like you in the future.
Okay, and a last question, maybe? Yep.
I was just intrigued to hear that you're not a fan of this democratic approach of
not at all
these
because well, for a number of reasons. One of them is that whoever becomes a dean or a head of department, they will never actually say what needs to be done it becomes a beauty competition. And so nobody will ever say anything that's unpopular. And so that means that difficult decisions are never made. And so issues are never faced. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that there is the question of, becoming a manager. It requires training, professional skill. And it can't be based just on whoever puts up their hand and say, I'll do it, and whoever says the right things to everybody. And that's the problem, because I would say that the people that decide who's going to be the dean, well, they're not informed, because they don't know, because they've not had experience of management, so that's, in a way, I think, even the Senate probably I don't agree with, because how do you get on the Senate? You don't have to go through an interview and demonstrate your deep awareness or experience or whatever. It's just whoever wants to be honest, and So I do think it's. Britain is. It's really problematic in all sorts of ways. But one of the things that changed, I think, in the last 20 years is really trying to professionalize management, and it hasn't happened here. And that means that all sorts of issues that I think need to be addressed are not being addressed. Nobody will address them because that's not how you get appointed. You make your way up an organization or up the organization through popularity, not through making the right decisions. Yeah. Which I know sounds like some sort of, I don't know, kind of capitalistic. But there's a difference between political life and an organization. Running an organization is different from party politics. But I appreciate that's probably in this room. That's certainly a minority view. But.
Okay, thank you very much. You will stay during the coffee breaks and later networking.
Coffee and it's in Brno, so of course.
Oh, perfect. Where is the best coffee place in Brno?
Skirg, maybe, but that's because I like to imagine that I'm hanging out with all these people that are about 30 years younger than I am as well. So yeah,
okay,
yeah.
So
he does have good coffee.
Yeah, I agree. So you can ask questions to Matthew directly during the coffee breaks. And I thank you again for a great talk. It's been very interesting and fun as well.